Let's take a moment and share some of the highlights of 2024, some of the best of as we prepare to move into the new year. You're listening to the PHEC podcast, episode 385. The field of public health is so broad, overlapping multiple industries. With epidemiology at the core of public health, there are an unlimited number of ways to target specific populations, health conditions, environmental issues, and causes that matter most to you. My name is Dr. Huntley, and I'm the host here on the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast. I'm an epidemiologist, consultant, and entrepreneur with over 20 years of experience in healthcare and public health. On this podcast, my guests and I engage in conversations that demonstrate the importance of public health and epidemiology across a variety of industries, helping you think outside the box and inspire greater positive impact in communities around the world. Now, let's dive into the topic of this brand new episode. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this episode. Well, this is officially our last episode of 2024, and I'm actually excited. There's a lot of us that, a lot of us feel very excited to wrap up a year and kind of turn the page into the new year as if, it's some big major step or transition. I think it's more psychological, but at any rate, it doesn't matter. It works for me because it helps me to feel a mental shift, a way of going fresh into a new year. And it's always something that I get excited about. So I spent a lot of time in the fourth quarter of the year reviewing what's working. I look at our analytics quite deeply and I start making decisions about what to do with the podcast and the business and so forth. So as we look at our podcast, my team and I looked at the podcast, we were reviewing really across the year, thinking about what we want. I've been talking about that on the previous episodes. We've got, we're really excited about creating a space for our community to come together again. Like I said, if you were a part of this podcast community years ago, you remember what that community was like. A long time ago, we had a Facebook group. And then, of course, we started on LinkedIn and that didn't work very well. But I miss the sense of community and getting together with you, regular listeners, and getting your feedback and having your input as we move into what we're going to do next. So looking into 2025, I really wanted to pour into this podcast community in a bigger way, building the community, but some other things that I don't want to get ahead of myself in announcing, but just know that we're investing in a big way in this podcast going into next year. And I'm excited. I'm excited about it. So as we, close out this year, as I'm looking at analytics, some really interesting things stood out to me. And I thought I would share a few of those with you on this podcast episode. So think of it sort of like the best of, and I think it's common at the end of the year for people to do a countdown of the best episodes or the best of whatever worked in sharing those insights and those analytics with community members. But I thought it was very timely to do that on this episode. So it won't take a lot of time, but two areas kind of stood out to me the most. I definitely want to talk about some episodes that really rose to the top based on analytics. And we get our analytics from our podcast server that feeds it out to multiple different podcast apps. We look at some of the primary apps to see where people are listening from. The majority of our listeners are tuning in. But for this purpose, we're just looking at our kind of parent server to see, because it comes from there out to all the other apps. So this is not really specific to a particular app. This is just overall some of our top episodes. Okay. But before I even go to some of the top episodes, I'm going to talk about where people are listening from in terms of geographic locations. And that it's very humbling to me to know this. Again, we started this podcast in 2017 and we've been consistent every single week with new episodes. And some weeks we've had bonuses. So there's actually more than our numbered episodes in terms of total. We have over 400 total episodes out, but some of those are marked as bonus episodes without an episode number. So for example, we release new episodes every Tuesday with a number, and this episode that you're listening to is episode 385. But we also sometimes will have a bonus episode maybe on a Friday and it doesn't get an episode number. So that's how we get to the total that's over 400 already. Little geeky fun fact. But, in previous years, I've talked about where our listeners are tuning in from. And I was really surprised to know, in sort of the countdown and just kind of watching where people are tuning into the podcast from. So let's talk about that first. I haven't really given this type of an update in a few years. So this is a little fresh. And if you've never heard that before, if you're relatively newer to the podcast, then this will be the first time we're diving into some of this. So I went over just to kind of refresh myself. There are 195 countries in the world, according to the United Nations. So keep that in the back of your mind as I talk about this. We have listeners that have tuned in, and I'm flipping around on different screens and looking at spreadsheets that I have. So if you're watching the video with this, you see my head going in all different directions. That's because I have these spreadsheets pulled up to chat with you. So we have over 142 countries. Yes, 142 countries where people have listened to this podcast. At least one or two people. Some of those countries, we have like one or two people that we can see have downloaded. But that's amazing. 141 countries. So at least one person from that country has heard the podcast episode. So that's fascinating to me because every person, we play with data, every number represents an individual. So I don't want to say, well, that doesn't matter because that's just one person. But no, that one person heard an episode of this podcast. And maybe that was something that was game changing. And that one person who heard some message or maybe connected with the guests that we had or heard something that they could apply in their communities that impacted that community. So we don't ever want to downplay the small numbers. I'm excited. I celebrate every number, every person that listens. But if we were to start to narrow this down, it was difficult for me because I want to give shout outs to 141 countries individually. But we had to start to narrow it down a little bit to kind of create what I wanted for this podcast episode. So I will say, I'm even going to give some more context. Let's say there are at least, if we were to cut it off at 100, okay? So let's just say that there are at least 22 countries where we've had more than 100 listeners of this podcast. That's pretty significant and pretty impressive. And I'm excited about that. Imagine 100, in fact, let's say 130 people in a room. It's a pretty decent sized room, but those people represent that one country that are listening to this podcast. That's phenomenal to me. And that's amazing. And we're a public health community. We're a little smaller, more niche anyway than compared to, say, healthcare or some other industries. So we're already a niche community. We're thinking about different countries. But I had to narrow this down quite a bit to be able to make this episode. So let me go over to my notes that I have. So I decided to just put the top 10 by sheer volume, not any other way being top 10. So in terms of the top 10 countries where we have the most listeners of the podcast, let's focus there. Of course, the first one is the United States. So we are based here in the United States. So it's not a surprise to any of you that, most of our listeners are coming from the United States. So let's focus on number 2. Or should we do the other direction? Doesn't quite matter, but I'm going to keep going in this order. Now, years ago when I did this, the last time I remember recording this or reporting this, I remember number 2 was the UK, the United Kingdom. And I was surprised because I guess I don't know what I thought, but it was surprising to me in a very pleasantly surprising way that the United Kingdom was the number 2 country in terms of volume of listeners of this podcast. However, Canada has taken the number 2 spot now. So my neighbor to the north, so if we look at our map, the United States, our neighbor to the north is Canada. So thank you, Canada, for all of our listeners. And we've got hundreds or in the thousands here for Canada that are listening to this podcast. I'm excited and I celebrate that. And actually, Canada is on my travel list. I'm really trying to make a trip to Canada. And of course, I love traveling and I love my personal travel for vacation, but I really want to try to connect this to some sort of business venture to go into Canada and then be able to spend a little bit more time and enjoy it as well. I have a lot of colleagues in Canada and I would love to be able to visit with you, meet some of you, especially in Toronto. We've talked about this. So I'm going to try to see what I can do to make that happen. It would be so much fun to come visit Canada, but then also to connect with some of you who are listening to the podcast while I'm there. It's been many years since I've been to Canada, so I'm really excited about the idea of returning back. Okay, so Canada's number 2. The United Kingdom is number 3, very close in terms of numbers to Canada. So Canada's only beating the UK by a few numbers, but I'm always excited to know that, I've got I've got a lot of friends. My last job that I had before going full-time in entrepreneurship, my last job was with a company that was based in London. And I've often talked about that. I worked as an epidemiologist. And so we have a lot of our team at that time was split between being US based and UK based. And then we had a lot of other people that worked in different countries, but specifically to our epidemiology team, we were split between the UK and the US. So some of those people I still keep in touch with on a regular basis. We're just personal good friends. And I did travel to the UK last year for business, and I was able to meet some friends and spend some time there. In fact, I went to a very nice restaurant for lunch that was right near London Bridge. So we literally sat at a restaurant, had lunch, and looking out the window, our view was London Bridge. So that was a lot of fun. At any rate, I thank all of you who listen, who are in the United Kingdom, regularly listen to this podcast. I have some very dear colleagues who are doing the good work of public health there. And I know there are some nuanced differences between our countries, but I really appreciate how we're able to collaborate and come together across what is essentially our foundation is the same and how we have the same focus. We just have different obstacles and courses that we have to follow to accomplish what we want to accomplish in public health. But thank you all for being loyal listeners of this podcast. I really appreciate you. And then moving down, so the US is first, Canada second, the United Kingdom is third. So in the number 4 spot is Australia. And I say that kind of surprisingly. The last time I reported this, I spoke how they kind of moved into the top 5 in terms of this category pretty quickly in a surprising way, but I'm so delighted to know that. And I've engaged with some folks from Australia. In fact, a couple of colleagues, when we had our Public Health Consulting and Entrepreneurship Expo a few years ago, we had a panelist who is a consultant from Australia. So it was exciting to have her connect with us. It's exciting just in general to know that we have connections, public health connections, and people who are listening to this podcast from that far away. That's also on my list of places I want to travel for a reason that feels almost silly, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So my husband and I adopted 2 new puppies earlier this year. We had adult dogs and we raised puppies. My kids, they grew up with my kids. And so we had 2 Maltese that passed away a few years apart. And then we adopted a big doodle. He's part German Shepherd and part standard poodle. So when I say big, I mean, when we got him, he was just under 100 pounds. And then we got him into a little bit better shape. And he still was a good, 90 pounds. But a big doodle and very typical doodle. So we adopted him as an adult. And then we lost him at the end of last year. So I decided I wanted to go the puppy route again. And this is such a long story. But anyway, I decided I wanted to start over with puppies. And we adopted 2 puppies. We were going in for 1, but we ended up, he had a friend. And so we ended up with 2 puppies. But this one that I'm thinking about is Australian Shepherd. So he is Australian Shepherd and Poodle mix. But this time he's a little smaller. So he's about, fully grown, they estimated 22 to 25 pounds, and he's about 22 pounds. And he is almost a year old now. So giving you all this backstory. But when we adopted him, the Australian Shepherd him, I gave him a name to connect with his Australian roots. I wanted him to have a name that connected him and reminded him of where he came from. And I kept telling my husband, now I'm ready to go visit Australia because of that. But his name is Tasmania. We call him Taz, short for Tasmania, which is, Australian. So why am I babbling to tell you all this? Because I just want you to know. That is why I'm personally interested in going to Australia. One of the reasons it's got my interest, it's a beautiful country I have never visited, and I would love to be there. So thank you for all of my listeners in Australia, and thank you for letting me babble on with that very long story that seems to be no way connected to this. But, sometimes we need to do things like that. I'm sure you have, your list of professional things that you want to accomplish, and you got your personal list. And I like it when they overlap. So if I have a business opportunity to travel to Australia, that would be wonderful. But if we just make that a part of our personal journey, then I'm going to make sure that we try to connect with our listeners who are in Australia. That would just be so delightful, because I can't imagine we would necessarily cross paths at our conferences that are here in the US, and we're so far apart otherwise that it would be really neat to have that opportunity to visit and then also engage with some of you in person. That would really make my day. So I'll have to make sure I notify you all of my plans to travel to Australia come up. Okay. So we've got United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and now in number 5 spot is Germany. Thank you to all of my listeners in Germany who are tuning into this podcast. And I'm really honored and humbled to think about that. That, first of all, this platform that we use allows us to reach people on a very broad global perspective, people that we wouldn't ordinarily run into, say, at conferences or events, not local, but in a very broad sense. So when we think about public health and we think about, our own countries, communities, we may serve in a very local, we can niche it down to our city, our county, or the people right in our, maybe even a zip code is your focus. That's awesome. And that's wonderful. And that's important, as well as when we span out and we look at global public health and, even when we think about the way that we travel. So even though I'm talking about, the people that are listening, I'm in the United States and people are listening in Australia and Germany and the UK and Canada, we're so different geographically, and we could easily travel and be together in the same location. You can think of a city that has a very global feel, London, New York, cities where we have people that are from so many other countries and backgrounds that come together. So the importance and the significance of global public health. I'm just kind of putting these dots and pieces and things in perspective because I was once upon a time, before I started this podcast, before I started working with that company I told you about that's based in London, before I did any of that, I worked here at the state that I live in. I worked for the state. And I really thought that if I did not work for the state, what else could I possibly do? I really could not think outside of that geographic location, that area, this area. And over the years, the world has been opened up to me. And when I sit here and I talk to you about all the people that are listening to our podcast from different countries and how humbling is and exciting it is for me, it's on multiple levels because I remember clearly a time when I did not think outside of my state in terms of impact or possibilities or opportunity. And now I'm telling you that, last year I traveled to the UK for business and met colleagues that I have engaged with over time. And people are listening to our podcast from literally all around the world. And I don't take that for granted. I don't take that lightly, which is why I'm taking the time to really slow it down and share some appreciation here because this is significant to me and it's important in the good work that we want to do and we intend to do through this podcast and through the community. That's why one of the reasons I'm so driven to find a place and have a way that we can build community and stay connected. And this community that I keep talking about will give an opportunity for us to connect with our listeners from all these different countries that are listening that aren't right here in the United States with me. And this gives us an opportunity to do that. So hopefully you are really understanding how important and how much I appreciate all of you. So thank you so much for all of you who are listening to this podcast. Continue to share it with people around you within your network so that we can continue to grow. So those are the 5 in terms of volume. I want to still mention the next 5 because each of these countries I'm going to mention represent hundreds of listeners in each of the countries. So these are big numbers. And I could go down to the next group of 10 and we'd still be talking in the hundreds, but I had to really narrow it down. So it just does not mean that I'm not appreciative of all. I just needed to narrow it down to a point here. So let me list the next 5 countries. So the top 5 one more time: United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and Germany. And then our next group of 5 in the same order of volume, but these numbers are pretty close. They're really close. We have India. So thank you to all my listeners who are listening from India. Singapore. Same. I appreciate you. I'm just excited to just name the countries. These are all places I would love to visit. So I hope that I get to visit all of these countries. Now, I've not been to any of these countries. China is next. So we have India, Singapore, China, and we have Taiwan, and we have Japan. So thank you so much for the hundreds of you from each of these countries who listen to this podcast on a consistent basis and share it within your networks. I appreciate all of you. And stay tuned. I'm working on a project where we can share with you more about the different countries that people are listening to our podcast from. I do want to have a way to share some love to all of our listeners. So we're working on a few ideas. Like I said, we're pouring into the podcast community. This is going into year 8 for us. So we've completed 7 full years of the podcast and we're going into year 8. And it's amazing how much we've grown. And I'm excited about the growth that we have coming up. All right, so let's talk about some of these episodes. So I'm going to say they're the most popular, but 5 really popular episodes by analytics for across the year, and then 2 more that deserve what I'm going to call honorable mention. So, of course, I think all of our podcast episodes are great. I looked at analytics in terms of, first I looked at which episodes get a lot of attention in that first 7 days of release. And then I looked at those episodes that get a lot of attention over the first 30 days of release. And then I looked at the first 90 days. And I decided to focus on the ones that fall between the 30 and the 90-day mark, because I think that as over time, as that momentum builds and people are listening and picking up on it, I thought that that really represented, and there's a little overlap. There were some that hit the mark in that 30 days in terms of popularity within the first 30 days after it's published, as well as within the first 90 days after it's published. So I found a lot of overlap and I thought, okay, these are truly popular episodes. And keep in mind, because I have to do some cutoff, those that have been released but haven't been 90 days yet from the time, that I'm recording this, or a little bit left out, which is how I ended up with kind of an honorable mention category to mention a couple of those that had all the indications of being a popular episode. Okay. So these are not coming in, these 5 I'm going to mention are not in a particular order, but I will give you the episode number and the title of the episode. And then we'll also link to them in the description for this episode and in the show notes for quick reference for you. Okay. So episode number, and these truly are not in a specific order, but episode 334. And the title was Healthcare Technology and Public Health with Vanessa Guzman. I remember that episode, and that's all of these are great to me. So I'm very biased, but this was released rather back in the beginning. So it's January of 2024. We have also episode 335 right after that one. And the title is When Work Becomes Personal. And that was released also in January. So that episode was with one of my team members here, contractor who worked on a project with me. We talked about some of the work that we were working on a project for a particular client and how this work had personal impact. We began to really feel it on a personal level and found ourselves discussing it within our circle friends and how that can spill over and have real positive impact beyond, what we're doing. So anyway, I don't want to spoiler alert here, but definitely check that one out. Let's see. Then we have episode 338, Cervical Health Awareness Discussion. And that was in February that we produced that one. That's a roundtable discussion episode. And I think they're all awesome. If you remember in the episode previously, I talked to you about our categories for the podcast. So you can easily find all of the roundtable episodes. But this one is one of the roundtable discussions that met that criteria for being in this top 5 for the year. And then we have episode 350 in April, at the end of April. And the title for that one is Data and Health Equity with Paulina Sosa. That was a great episode. All of them. Okay, so I say all of them are great. They are. But definitely check that out. And then finally, I have episode 352, Healthcare Innovation and Public Health with Dr. Stephen Martin. And that was May 14th. So those are our top 5 in terms of popularity, solid analytics that, back these up. So if you missed any of them, you definitely want to check them out. And like I said, show notes is where you can find the quick links, or you can search for them by the numbers that I've given you, the title, the number from our website. Okay, so the 2 honorable mention that came out a little bit later in the year, we have both are in August. So episode 365, Humanizing Public Health Work is one. and that was from August 13th. And then we also have episode 367, The Power of Listening, a Client Story. And this was August 27th that it was published. We will share the links. I certainly want you to catch up on all the episodes. But if you missed a lot, or if you're new to the podcast and you wanted to grab the highlights of this year, I would recommend at least you could binge on these, 7 that I've listed here. But also you can look at our categories for the website and have fun with that. So there's multiple ways for you to consume these episodes. But I thought that it would be a little fun to share some of these analytics with you on this episode. Again, sincerely appreciate all of you for listening and being a part of this podcast family. I'm excited to move into the new year, and I would love to hear from you. We'll be sharing about our community soon, results and what we're going to do. And I hope that you will become a part of that so that we can engage a little bit more closely as well. All right, everyone. Until next time, have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast. Visit phecpodcast.com to find the show notes for each episode and to learn how to work with me.